Good evening, and welcome back. Pull your chair a little closer. It does not matter whether you are listening from a quiet room with the lights turned low, from a car moving through darkness on a road you half know, or from a kitchen where something is cooling on the stove. You are here, and I am glad for it. Before we begin, I want to ask, as I always do, that you let me know where in the world you are tonight. You do not have to answer out loud, but hold it in your mind, the specific weight of your particular dark, the particular quality of whatever silence or noise surrounds you. The story we are telling tonight was born in a place where the dark was very particular indeed. A desert dark, a river dark, a dark so total and so old that the people who lived inside it decided it must be the first thing, the source and ground of all that came after. This is the story of Osiris, of the god who died and refused, in the most profound and complicated way imaginable, to stay dead. It is also, though it will take some time to become this, a story about us. In the beginning, there was nothing, which is to say there was none. The Egyptians were precise about this, in a way that the word nothing fails to honor. None was not an absence. None was a presence, a vast, dark, undifferentiated potential, a kind of water that was not water, a kind of dark that was not merely the absence of light, but was itself a thing, a substance, a condition. None had weight. None had depth. If you could have stood inside none, which you could not, because there was no inside and no outside, no above and no below, no standing and no falling, you would have felt it pressing against you from every direction simultaneously, not hostile, not threatening, simply complete in itself, requiring nothing, expecting nothing, going nowhere. Some say none was without limit. Others say none's limits were the limits of what the mind could hold before it broke. The priests of Hermopolis, a city that will matter, though not yet, spoke of none as one of 8 primordial qualities, 4 pairs of serpents and frogs who swam in the chaos and embodied its essential properties, darkness and invisibility, the shapeless and the boundless, the hidden and the nowhere. 8 qualities, 2 genders, 1 condition. This was the Ogdoad, and in their telling, it was the Ogdoad's own inner pressure that finally produced the first rupture. But the priests of Heliopolis, and this is the telling that concerns us most tonight, had a different accounting. In their telling, none was not a committee, none was a womb, and from that womb, through a process that defies the word process, because process implies time, and time did not yet exist, something stirred. He was called Atum, or he was called Ra, or he was called Atum Ra, which is a kind of theological compromise that we should not dismiss too quickly, because the Egyptians understood something that later monotheism sometimes forgot, that a god's names are not aliases for a single fixed entity, but facets of a reality too large for any one name to hold. Atum meant the complete one, or perhaps the undone one. 2 translations that seem to contradict each other until you hold them simultaneously and feel how they resolve. Ra meant the sun, the disk, the light that divides. Together, they were the primordial solar divinity, the force of differentiation itself, the thing that makes things distinct from each other, the original. And then there was light. Except this light did not merely illuminate, it created by seeing, it made real by naming. Atum rose from none on a mound. The Egyptians called this the benben, a pyramidal hillock, the first solid thing, the original piece of ground. There is something almost comic about it, if you let yourself see it. The infinite, featureless abyss, and then, in the middle of it, a small hill, a patch of dry ground, a place to stand. The first landscape was no larger than a garden plot, and on it stood a god who had not asked to exist, who had always existed, who was simultaneously the mound and the thing standing on the mound and the act of standing itself. Atum looked at himself. There was nothing else to look at. In some tellings, this is where loneliness enters the world, which means loneliness is older than company, older than love, older than conflict. The god looked at himself in the mirror of Nun's dark water and understood, in some pre-linguistic way that predates the word understood, that a single thing is not yet real. For a thing to be real, it must be distinguishable from other things. To be distinguishable, you need at least two. Atum was one. He was therefore, in some technical sense, nothing, despite existing, despite being, in fact, the only thing. This problem required a solution that was also a creation. Atum, and here the texts become delicate, and the priests of later eras became evasive or euphemistic. Atum created from himself. The act of creation was also the act of division. He breathed out Shu, the god of air, the space between things. He spat or sneezed out Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, the condition that makes air inhabitable. And now there were three things where there had been one, which meant there was a between, which meant there was space, which meant there was, if we are careful about it, the first germ of what would eventually become time. Shu and Tefnut were the first children, the first family. They wandered in the not yet world, exploring the darkness their father had not yet illuminated, and Atum, alone again on his mound, felt what we might recognize as the first parental anxiety. He sent his eye to find them. His eye left his face and traveled into the dark, and during its absence, Atum grew another eye to replace it. When the first eye returned with the children, it found itself displaced, and it was angry. Atum appeased it by placing it on his forehead, where it became the uraeus, the cobra eye, the solar disk's protector, the thing that burns away enemies. From jealousy and appeasement, a weapon. The Egyptians noted this without apparent alarm. Shu and Tefnut, together in the dark, produced two children, Geb, the earth, solid and patient, and Nut, the sky, curved and glittering and infinite. And here, the world's first great separation occurred. Geb and Nut loved each other with a completeness that left no room for anything else. They lay wrapped around each other, her body arched over his, pressed together so tightly that no light could pass between them. No rain could fall, no seed could germinate. The world was alive, but airless. The world existed, but could not breathe. Atum commanded Shu, the god of the space between things, to do what he was made to do. Shu rose. He placed himself between his children. He lifted Nut above his head, her fingers touching the east horizon, her toes resting in the west, her star-scattered belly the night sky. Geb lay beneath, his contours the hills and valleys of the earth. Between them, air. Between them, distance. Between them, the possibility of seasons, of rain, of the agricultural miracle of flood and planting and harvest. Between them, everything that Egypt would become. But Nut was pregnant when Shu separated them. She carried within her the children of Geb's love, and now she could not set them down. She moved across the sky in her daily arc, and the children moved with her, and the children could not be born because there was, and this is where the story requires a moment of careful attention, a prohibition. Ra himself had decreed that Nut could bear no children in any month of the year. Some say this was because a prophecy warned him that Nut's children would surpass him. Some say it was simpler than that. The god of order had decreed that the sky should not give birth, because birth requires contact with the earth, and Nut was separated from Geb by the entire extent of the atmosphere. The children were trapped. The world was complete, but something was missing from it. And into this situation walked, or rather, gambled himself into it, a god named Thoth. Thoth was the god of knowledge, of writing, of the moon, of calculation, of magic in its most intellectual and scribal form. He was depicted as an ibis-headed man carrying a palette and a reed, or sometimes as a baboon, and the juxtaposition should give you a sense of his range. The precise civil servant and the cackling animal, the keeper of records and the creature that howls at the moon. He was the mediator, the measurer, the one who keeps score. Thoth went to the moon, and he gambled with it. Some say he gambled against the moon itself. Some say he played against Khonsu, the moon god. Some say the opponent is unnamed. What matters is that Thoth won. He won a fraction of moonlight, a 72nd of each day, which seems small until you add it up. Over 72 days, Thoth had collected the equivalent of 5 full days of light, 5 days that did not belong to any month, 5 days that existed outside the regular year, in a gap between the end of one year and the beginning of the next. 5 intercalary days, 5 days in which Nut could give birth without violating the prohibition. On the first day, she bore Osiris. On the second, Horus the Elder. On the third, Set. On the fourth, Isis. On the fifth, Nephthys. 5 births, 5 gods, and the world had its protagonists. This is not a digression. The method of Osiris's birth, the stolen time, the gap in the calendar, the loophole in divine law, will echo through everything that follows. Osiris is born in borrowed time. He lives in borrowed time. He conquers death, ultimately, by understanding something that even the gods who killed him did not, that time is not a straight line but a wheel, and that the wheel has gaps, and that in those gaps, impossible things become possible. Hold that thought. We will need it later. The 5 children of Nut and Geb grew, and they grew into their domains and their natures with a completeness that felt, to the older gods, both impressive and slightly alarming. Osiris was tall, dark-skinned, the color of the Nile's black silt, the color of fertility, the color of the earth after the flood recedes and leaves behind its gift of richness. He was gentle in a way that the Egyptians did not consider weakness, gentle the way a deep river is gentle, patient, inevitable, comprehensive. His eyes were the eyes of someone who has already seen where everything ends up and has made peace with it. Isis was his sister and his wife, a pairing that requires no apology in the context of the divine, where such categories bend to serve the story's needs. Isis was the magician, the healer, the one who knew the secret name of Ra himself. She was clever in a way that the word clever cheapens. Her intelligence was structural, architectural. She could see the load-bearing walls of reality and knew which ones could be moved and which ones would bring the ceiling down. She loved Osiris with a precision that looked, from outside, like devotion, but was actually a form of engineering. She had built a world around him. She had studied every angle of loss and decided she would not accept it. Set was red. This is important. The Egyptians coded their world in color with a seriousness we should not underestimate. And Set was the color of the desert, the color of blood, the color of storm clouds and violence, and the foreign places where Egypt's orderly agriculture had no purchase. He was powerful, physically, magnetically powerful, the god who could hold back the snake Apophis each night on the solar boat, the god whose strength was necessary and whose nature was destructive and whose existence the cosmos required and resented simultaneously. Set was not a villain in the simple sense. He was something more uncomfortable than a villain. He was the thing that order needs to acknowledge to remain honest about what order costs. Nephthys was Set's wife, though her sympathies ran the other direction. She was the lady of the house, the goddess of what is hidden and enclosed, and her marriage to Set was a theological arrangement rather than a love match. She would matter, later, in a way that will surprise you. Horus the Elder is a god who fades into the background of this particular story, a version of Horus who predates the story's most important Horus, a placeholder in the genealogy, a reminder that the myths accreted over centuries and that not every layer fits perfectly with every other layer. The Egyptians were not troubled by this. They kept both Horuses and let them coexist. We can do the same. Osiris became king. This requires some elaboration because the kingship of Osiris was not simply a political arrangement. It was a cosmological fact, the hinge on which the human and divine worlds swung. Geb, the earth god, passed his authority to his children, and among the children, Osiris received the throne. Or Osiris received the throne because he was the eldest, or he received it because his nature, that patient, silt-black, river-deep nature, was most suited to the task of governance. The stories are not entirely consistent on the mechanism. but they are unanimous on the result. Osiris was king, and under his kingship, the world learned what it could be. He taught humanity to farm. This seems humble until you consider what farming actually is: the systematic domestication of chaos, the imposition of pattern on the random violence of weather and soil. Osiris taught people to turn the river's gift of silt into bread, to read the seasons, to plant and harvest and store against the lean months. He gave them grain, he gave them the vine, he gave them the fig tree, and the understanding that the fig tree requires patience. You plant it for your children, not for yourself. He taught them law, not the law of force, but the law of relation, the agreements that make living together possible instead of merely survivable. He taught them music, which is the law of time made audible. He traveled, he went out through the world, and here the myths suggest a world that extends beyond Egypt's borders, a world where the god-king's mission was not local but universal, spreading cultivation, spreading the knowledge of the grain and the grape, spreading the basic compact between humanity and the nourishing earth. Isis governed Egypt in his absence, efficiently and without drama. She was competent in a way that freed him to be generous. Set watched all of this. Set watched all of this. Set watched all of this, which the stories sometimes call jealousy and sometimes call something older and more structural than jealousy, a resentment that was almost physical, an allergy to the thing Osiris embodied. Osiris was the ordered world, the flooded and receding river, the planted field, the patient accumulation. Set was the desert at the field's edge, the wind that moves the sand. They were not merely brothers in conflict, they were incompatible principles forced to share a substrate. Set's plan, when it came, was theatrical. He was, among his other qualities, theatrical. He had a chest built, a beautiful chest, a masterwork of wood and cedar and ebony and ivory, inlaid with gold and precious stones. He waited for the right moment, a feast, a gathering of the gods, wine flowing, the atmosphere loose and celebratory. He brought out the chest, and he made a game of it. Whoever could fit inside it perfectly, he announced, would receive it as a gift. One by one the gods tried. One by one they found it too large, or too small, or not quite right. Osiris, curious, stepped in. He was, after all, a generous king who delighted in games, who understood that play was a form of the trust that holds communities together. He stepped in and lay down, and the chest fit him perfectly because it had been built to his exact dimensions, secretly measured while he slept. Set slammed the lid. His 72 conspirators, 72, the same number as the pieces of moonlight Thoth had won to make the Intercalary days, and this cannot be a coincidence, rushed forward and sealed the chest with molten lead. They carried it to the Nile and threw it in. The chest floated. It moved north and then west, carried on currents that seemed to have an opinion about where it was going. It washed up eventually at Byblos, on the coast of what we would call Lebanon, where a great tamarisk tree grew up around it and enclosed it within its trunk, the wood wrapping the chest in a living embrace that was almost an act of mourning. The king of Byblos, Noticing that this particular tamarisk had grown unusually large and fragrant and significant, had it cut down and used as a pillar in his palace. Osiris was inside a pillar in a foreign king's hall, the god of fertility and cultivation, enclosed in wood in a building, in a land beyond Egypt's borders. Isis found out. How she found out is told differently in different versions. A whisper from the wind, a crow's eye testimony, her own magic making the air confess what it had witnessed. She tore her dress, she cut her hair, she put on the clothes of mourning, and she left Egypt to search. The journey of Isis is one of the strangest sequences in the myth, and one of the most human. She traveled alone through lands that did not know her. She sat down near a well, and here, abruptly, the scale changes. The cosmic drama of dead gods and sealed chests gives way to a scene that could be from any folktale. A grieving woman sitting at a well, and children coming to draw water, and a conversation. Isis braided the children's hair. She breathed on them, and they smelled of her breath, which smelled of something unnameable, something that was both flowers and time. The children's mother, the queen of Byblos, found them and recognized that something divine had touched them, and summoned the woman from the well to her court. Isis became the nurse of the queen's youngest child, and here the myth pauses at a scene that is very specific, very strange, and very important. At night, Isis would put the infant in a fire, burning away his mortality, giving him immortality, one night at a time. She transformed herself into a swallow and flew around the pillar that contained the chest that contained Osiris, crying. The swallow is the bird of longing, the bird of the person who has left and not yet returned. The queen saw the fire and screamed. The moment she screamed, the spell broke. The infant would remain mortal. This is the myth's first meditation on how the miraculous fails, not because it cannot succeed, but because we cannot maintain the presence of mind to let it. We see something impossible, and we react before we think, and in the space of that reaction, the impossible closes. Isis revealed herself. The king and queen, appropriately terrified and appropriately reverent, gave her the pillar. She opened it herself. She took the chest. She opened the chest in a marsh, alone, in the dark, and she held the body of her husband, and she, the magician, the engineer of reality, she found the one thing she could not fix. He was dead. His heart was not beating. The breath was not in him. She could do many things, Isis, but she could not undo death with her hands and her words alone. She needed more than magic. She needed biology. She transformed herself into a kite, a falcon, a bird of prey, and she hovered over him, and she beat her wings, and her wings generated breath, and she breathed him back to enough life, for long enough, to conceive a child. This is told with remarkable frankness in some versions, and with elegant obliqueness in others. But the result is consistent. Isis left that marsh pregnant. She hid the body in the marshes, and she went to give birth. Set found the body. Some say he was hunting by moonlight. Some say his red instinct led him to the right marsh at the right time. He found the chest, and he opened it, and he looked at his brother, and he did what he did next, out of something that was beyond rage, a need to make the death permanent, to exceed what he had done, to make sure there was no coming back from this. He cut the body into 14 pieces, some say 42. He scattered the pieces across Egypt. He threw some in the river. He buried some in the desert. He made of his brother's body a map of destruction, and the map was as large as Egypt itself. Isis found the pieces, one by one. With Nephthys, Osiris's sister, Set's estranged wife, the keeper of hidden things, she traveled Egypt, assembling the map in reverse. There is a version of this search that takes years. There is a version in which each place she found a piece became a sacred site, a temple, an axis of worship. Egypt, in this reading, became a body, the body of Osiris, its sacred geography, the geography of divine dismemberment. Every temple was a wound and a memorial simultaneously. She found 13 pieces. The 14th, the phallus, had been eaten by a Nile fish, the Oxyrhynchus, the Lepidotus, the Phagrus. The versions disagree on the species and agree on the fact. She fashioned a replacement from gold or from cedar, and she assembled what she had, and she performed the rites that Thoth had taught her, and she called on Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, the god of the in-between, and with Anubis's knowledge and her own magic, she did something unprecedented. She wrapped the body in linen. She anointed it with oils and resins. She spoke over it the words of power that held the soul tethered to the flesh. She called to Osiris's soul, the Ba, the bird-headed spirit that had flown free, and she asked it to return, just for a moment, just long enough for Anubis to bind the pieces back into a whole. Osiris breathed. His eyes opened. He could not stay. This is the part of the story that is so important and so quietly devastating that I want to pause before the next sentence and let it sit. He could not stay. He was the first of the dead, the inventor of death, the proof that death existed, and also that death was not the same as annihilation. He could not return to the living world because the living world required a different kind of body, a body that participated in time's forward movement, a body that aged and hungered and bled. His body was outside of that now. He was the king of the dead, because the dead needed a king, because without a king, the dead would be nothing, would have no country, no law, no continuity. He went down into the underworld, into the Duat, into the place beneath the world that was also the place beneath the earth, where seeds wait for spring. And there he became what he became, the judge of the dead, the Lord of eternity, the one who weighs the heart against the feather. His son was born. Isis named him Horus, not the elder Horus, but this Horus, her Horus, the posthumous child of a dead god and a desperate mother, raised in secret in the marshes of the Delta while Set ruled Egypt. This Horus began small. He began fragile. He began with snake bites and scorpion stings and the ordinary fevers of marsh children. And each time Isis called on the power of his father's name, the power of the dead king's authority, and each time the child recovered. He was being assembled, you might say, being made durable by the accumulation of survived dangers. He grew into a hawk-headed young man, or a young man who wore the hawk as his face, which is not the same thing. He was his father's heir and his uncle's nemesis and his mother's greatest work. He was also something new, the first of the gods who had a specifically human story, who had grown up, who had experienced vulnerability and protection and the specific education of someone raised in hiding. He had been a secret. He was now a question. Would the secret hold? Would the marsh protect him until he was strong enough to answer for himself? I should say here that this period, the hidden childhood of Horus, is described in texts that feel, to me, different from the grander cosmological passages. They are smaller, more detailed. There are snakes specified by type. There are remedies listed. There is a sense that someone wrote these stories from close up, from the marsh level, from the perspective of a mother checking on a sleeping child in the dark. The mythology drops altitude and gets specific, and I am never sure whether that specificity is ancient or whether it accumulated over centuries as ordinary people added their ordinary fears to the story of a child in danger. I have kept those details. I think they matter. Horus eventually made his claim. He went before the divine council, the Ennead, the 9 great gods, and he stated his case. He was the son of Osiris, the legitimate heir to the throne of Egypt, and Set had obtained the throne through murder and should give it back. Set contested this. Of course he contested this. The trial of Horus and Set is one of the longest, strangest, most digressive documents in the whole of Egyptian literature. It goes on for what seems like 80 years of divine time, and during those 80 years the council debates and dithers and reaches no conclusion. Ra sides with Set, or seems to, because Set is the one who fights Apophis each night, and Ra values practical utility. Thoth sides with Horus, because Thoth values legitimacy and precedent. Isis intervenes repeatedly, using magic and disguise and outright manipulation, and is repeatedly told by the council to stop intervening, and repeatedly declines to stop. In one extraordinary episode, the 2 gods fight in the form of hippopotami at the bottom of the river. Whoever can stay submerged longest is the victor. Isis, watching from above, throws a harpoon into the water and hits Horus by mistake, and Horus shouts at her in a rage that the texts render with uncomfortable specificity, and she pulls back and throws again, and this time hits Set, and Set calls to her, calls to his sister, appeals to the blood tie, the family before the war, and Isis lets him go. Horus is furious. His fury is the fury of someone who has been fighting this war so long that he has forgotten that his mother is also Set's sister, that the family structure here is more tangled than the clean narrative of justice would prefer. There is a passage, and this is one I want to linger on, even if it takes me slightly off the main thread, where Set and Horus attempt to conceive children upon each other in what the text presents as a dominance contest, and Isis intervenes to redirect the outcome and the result is that Set unwittingly ingests something of Horus's essence, and when this becomes apparent before the council, Set is humiliated. The texts present this with complete seriousness. Modern readers have varying reactions to it. The Egyptians seem to have considered it simply another move in a very long game, another instance of Isis's willingness to use every available tool, another episode in a conflict that had stopped being about justice and started being about endurance. Let me collect the thread. 80 years of trial and combat and interference and manipulation and appeal. The world divided, Egypt suffering under Set's rule in a way that the texts describe as the land of the red, the land of chaos, the land where the flood did not behave properly and the crops were uncertain, and the sense of rightness that makes civilized life possible had gone slightly sideways. It was finally resolved, as so many divine impasses are resolved, not by argument, but by appeal to a higher authority. Osiris, from the Underworld, sent a message. He reminded the council that he had given them barley and wheat. He reminded them that the gods themselves ate, and what they ate came from him, from his domain, from the rich black earth that was his body and his legacy. He asked what would happen if he withheld his gift. He asked this in the most civil possible way, and the civility of it was more terrifying than any threat would have been. The council gave the throne to Horus. Set received something in compensation, and here the myth shows its structural honesty. Set was not destroyed. Set was not imprisoned. Set was given his place. The storms, the desert, the chaos beyond the horizon, the vital function of fighting Apophis on the solar boat. The world needed Set. The world needed Set. The world needed Set. But in here, there's a story. Soft and steady, Osiris remained king of the dead. The two kingdoms were defined, the living world above, the dead world below, each with its legitimate sovereign, each governed by the proper nature of its king. But I am moving too fast. The trial is not where I want to spend our time tonight. The trial is the formal resolution, the institutional answer to what was, at its heart, an intimate catastrophe. What I want to stay with for a moment is what happened between Osiris's death and Horus's victory, the long middle of the story, the time that the myth treats as both the darkest period and the most generative one. Isis, pregnant and alone, hiding in the marshes, the body of Osiris, wrapped and embalmed and tended by Anubis and Nephthys, lying in the underworld, Set ruling above, Horus growing below. These are the elements of the middle, and the middle is where the myth does its deepest work. The Egyptians had a concept they called Maat. Maat was the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order, depicted as a woman with a feather in her hair. The feather of truth, the feather that was weighed against the human heart in the judgment of the dead. But Maat was also a condition, not merely a person. It was the state of things being right, the river flooding at the right time, the sun rising at the right time, the king ruling with the right combination of strength and generosity, the dead being properly mourned and properly buried, and properly remembered. Maat was not a fixed state, but an ongoing achievement, something that required constant maintenance, constant ritual attention. You could not assume Maat. You had to make it, every day, with every offering, and every righteous judgment, and every properly performed burial rite. Set's reign was a reign without Maat, not because Set was utterly lawless. He was a god, after all, and gods are not lawless, but because his nature was not calibrated for the maintenance of Maat. He was built for the edge, not the center. Under his rule, something that had been reliable became unreliable. Something that had been nourishing became withholding. Something that had been right went slightly, persistently, intolerably wrong. This is one of the myth's most sophisticated ideas. Evil, in the Egyptian cosmos, is not primarily about malice. It is about misplacement. Set in the desert is necessary. Set on the throne is wrong. The same entity, the same power, the same God, and the difference between order and disorder is simply whether he is where his nature allows him to function correctly. This is a structural theory of ethics that I find more interesting than most of its competitors, and I am aware that I am editorializing, and I am going to keep going anyway. There were heroes before Horus. There were figures who moved through the world that Osiris had built and left their marks on it, who carry in their stories the same patterns, the same kehanet kachish gerchekleşme, the same prophecy flight fulfillment cycle that will run like a musical theme through the whole of this history. The first I want to tell you about tonight is Thoth himself, because Thoth, the divine record keeper, the gambler of moonlight, the one who made Osiris's birth possible, is himself a figure of peculiar origin and peculiar destiny. He was born, in some accounts, from the brow of Set, from violence, from the red god's excess, which gave him an ambivalent position in the divine family, son of the chaos god, servant of order, keeper of knowledge, master of the measurement that makes chaos legible. He was raised in the halls of Ra, educated in the cosmic archives, given custody of the words that had power over reality, the Hekau, the magical words, the operating system beneath the appearance of things. His mission was never singular. He was mediator between Ra and Osiris, between Horus and Set, between the living and the dead, between the human world and the divine. He was the one the gods called when they needed someone who could move between camps without being claimed by either. His special gift was exactly what you would expect from someone in his position. He could see the whole board. He could see where the pieces had been and where they were going. He had won time from the moon and given it to Nut, and in doing so, had opened the possibility of Osiris's existence, which meant that everything Osiris did, every field he taught humanity to tend, every law he gave them, every soul he would eventually judge, was, at several removes, Thoth's doing. The victory of Thoth is never announced. His legacy is not a tomb or a dynasty, but a library. The words he wrote became the spells that Isis used to revive her husband. The measurements he made became the calendar that governed Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. His emblem, the palette and the reed is the emblem of every scribe who ever set pen to papyrus in the service of memory. He did not conquer death directly. He gave the tools to those who would. Let me tell you about Anubis. Anubis was born in complicated circumstances that the myths handle with the oblique tact the Egyptians applied to uncomfortable truths. His mother was Nephthys, Set's wife, Osiris's sister, the goddess of what is hidden. His father, in most versions, was Osiris, though Nephthys had disguised herself as Isis to attract him, and Osiris, who loved Isis, had been deceived. In other versions, the father is Set, and Anubis is the child of the very god he would come to oppose by serving Osiris in death. Either genealogy gives him an origin defined by concealment, by the gap between appearance and reality, by a birth that required something to be hidden. Nephthys, afraid of Set's response, exposed the infant on the desert's edge. Isis found him. Isis, who had reason to resent the circumstances of his birth, who had reason to see him as the product of her husband's infidelity, however coerced. Isis took him in. This detail is not always noticed, but I think it is one of the most important in the whole myth. Isis raised the child whose existence was a record of her husband's deception of her. She saw in him not the insult, but the child. Anubis grew into the jackal, the animal of the cemetery edge, the creature who moves between the village and the desert, between the living and the dead. He became the embalmer because his birth had made him intimate with the gap between what things appear to be and what they are, between the body that is and the soul that has left it. When Osiris was killed and his body was gathered and wrapped, it was Anubis who performed the rites. It was Anubis who held the scales in the Hall of Two Truths. His mission was the weighing. Every soul that came to the afterlife came before Anubis, came before the great scales, and on one side was placed the heart, the seat of conscience, of memory, of everything the person had been, and on the other side was placed Maat's feather. If the heart and the feather balanced, the soul passed on to Aru, the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. If the heart was heavier, laden with wrongdoing, with cruelty, with the specific moral weight of a life that had made the world worse, the heart was eaten by Amit, the crocodile lion hippo chimera, the devourer, and the soul was annihilated, not punished, annihilated. There was no Egyptian hell in the Christian sense. There was only the scales and what tipped them. Anubis, the child of concealment and abandonment, raised by the wife his father had wronged, became the most impartial figure in the divine economy. He who had the most reason to carry grudges presided over the one process that required the complete absence of them. The Egyptians noticed this. They meant it. There is a figure the myths spend less time on than she deserves, and I want to pause on her for a moment, precisely because the imbalance bothers me. Her name is Nephthys, and she is described most often as a placeholder, a foil, a wife who doesn't much like her husband, a figure defined by her relationships to more active characters. She is Isis's shadow, Set's discontented spouse, Anubis's ashamed mother. But look at what she actually does in the story. She searches for the pieces of Osiris with Isis, moves through the same grief-charged Egypt, covers the same ground. She mourns in the Lamentations texts with an eloquence that matches her sister's and sometimes exceeds it. She raises her son, or lets him be raised, without making his existence into a crisis that serves her. She stays near Set's house while her sympathies run toward Osiris's, which requires a specific kind of courage that the myth does not dramatize, but which I think deserves at least a sentence here. The Egyptians depicted her as a woman with a hieroglyph on her head, the hieroglyph for house or enclosure. She is the lady of the house. She is the principle of enclosed space, of the interior, of what is kept inside rather than announced. Her power was the power of the threshold. She stood at the boundary between inside and outside, between the living household and the cemetery beyond the village edge. She was present at births. She was present at deaths. She was present at everything that happened at the edge of one state and the beginning of another. We should have told her story at greater length. I think the people who told these myths knew it. There is a trace of guilt in how thoroughly the lamentation texts preserve her voice, as if to compensate for what the narrative structure took from her. Now, Horus. I have been putting Horus off because Horus requires space. He is the hero of the myth in the most active sense, the one who fights, who suffers, who makes the legal case and makes it again, who endures the long trial and emerges with the throne. He is the prototype of the Egyptian pharaoh, which means every pharaoh who ever lived in Egypt was in some sense a version of him, was a ritual reenactment of his legitimacy, was the living proof that the story had a good ending. His birth we have already touched, posthumous, miraculous, the child of Isis's determined magic and a dead god's briefly revived body. He was born in the marsh, which is the right place for something that will be both water and sky. Marsh is neither the river nor the desert, but the wet, generative, slightly dangerous middle between them. He was stung by scorpions as an infant. He was bitten by snakes. He was left alone in the papyrus thickets, while Isis went to do what she needed to do. And each time she returned, he was sick or hurt or worse. And each time she called on his father's name, "You are the son of Osiris," and the fever broke, and the wound closed, and the child survived. There is something in this that I keep returning to. The father's name as medicine, the father's name as the one thing Isis could give the child that she had not been able to give herself. The name of the dead man spoken to the living child as the specific remedy for the dangers of a dangerous world. He was educated by Thoth, by Isis, by the accumulated knowledge of the divine world. He was trained in magic, in combat, in legal argument. He was taught the names of things, which in Egypt was the same as being taught their natures, because the name was the nature, the word was the thing. He was given the eye, or he would be given the eye, after he lost it. And the losing and the regaining of the eye is one of the myth's central events, a symbol so layered that the text around it can only gesture at what it means. In the battle with Set, in the wars that punctuated the long trial, Set tore out Horus's eye, the left eye, the moon eye, the eye of night vision, of the interior, of what can be seen when the sun is not shining. Set claimed it. Thoth intervened and restored it, healed it, returned it, made it whole again, and the restored eye became a powerful symbol, the Wedjut, the eye of wholeness, the eye of what has been broken and restored and is now more powerful for having been broken. The Wedjut appears in amulets, in burial goods, in temple walls. It appears in the mathematics of fractions in Egyptian notation, where the parts of the eye represent powers of 2 and the whole eye equals 1, except that the parts add up to 63/64ths, not to 1, and the missing 64th part was said to have been supplied by Thoth's own magic, by the god of knowledge, adding himself to the equation to make it whole. This is the kind of detail that I find almost unbearably precise in what it says about the nature of restoration. You can put the pieces back together and they will almost equal what they were, and the remaining gap will be filled by something from outside the original, something given, something added, something that was not there before the breaking. Wholeness after damage is not the same as the original wholeness. It is something else, something that requires a different name. Horus got the throne. I have already told you this. I want to say it again, because it is important, not just as resolution, but as statement. The legitimate heir, who had waited 80 years, who had been stung and bitten and tried and challenged and had his eye torn out and had fought in the form of a hippopotamus at the bottom of the Nile, got the throne. The world's order was restored. Maat was renewed. The dead king's son became king, and the dead king in the underworld received the news and was satisfied. His legacy was everything. He was every pharaoh. He was the principle of legitimate succession. He was the proof that the universe tends, however slowly, however painfully, toward the resolution of its imbalances. He was also, and this is the part that the ritual texts make clear, he was his father, not metaphorically, when the pharaoh performed the proper rites, when he offered to Osiris and judged righteously and maintained Maat. He was Osiris temporarily embodied in the living world. The father lived in the son. The dead king animated the living king. The story did not end with Horus's coronation. It became the template that all subsequent coronations would reenact. World without end. The Great War, if we want to call it a war, though it was more like a long, terrible argument that sometimes broke into violence. The Great War of Horus and Set is the collective catastrophe that the myth moves toward from the beginning. Every individual story has been a tributary flowing toward this river. Every character has been positioned by birth and nature and training and loss to play their role in the conflict that will define the world. On one side, Horus, backed by Isis, by Thoth, by Anubis, by the assembled weight of legitimacy and the accumulated sympathy of the gods who understood what Maat required. On the other side, Set, backed by his own formidable strength, by Ra's pragmatic appreciation for the god who fights Apophis, by the structural fact that he had held the throne for 80 years and had the momentum of possession. The combat between them took forms that the texts multiply with an exuberance that suggests the mythographers enjoyed the variety. They fought as men, as hippopotami, as serpents. They competed in building ships from stone. Set made his from the mountaintop and it sank. Horus made his of cedar wood that he had disguised as stone, and it floated. They engaged in contests before the council that the texts describe as games, but which were clearly trials of nature, each god demonstrating, by the manner of his actions, what kind of principle he embodied. The council, as I said, dithered, Ra worried. The gods of lesser rank watched and waited. Thoth argued the case with the precision of a scribe who has read every precedent. Isis fought with the weapons of intelligence and magic, which were the only weapons she had and which proved, over 80 years, to be sufficient. The turning point was Osiris's letter. I have mentioned it briefly, and I want to return to it, because it strikes me as the most quietly powerful moment in the entire myth. Osiris, from below, from the Duat, from the kingdom of the dead that he had been building and ruling for the duration of the conflict, Osiris wrote to the council. He wrote in the way the dead communicate, which is through the persistence of their having mattered, through the indelibility of what they made while they lived. He asked about barley and wheat. He asked what the council intended to do about Maat. The letter worked not because it was a threat, though it was, in the way that the most polite letters are the most devastating threats, but because it reminded everyone of what they owed. The gods ate. They ate the grain that came from Osiris's gift, from Osiris's body, from the black silt, and the patient cultivation that Osiris had brought to the world. The dead king was still feeding them. He would always be feeding them. The question of who sat on his throne was also, therefore, the question of whether the people who ate his grain were willing to honor what that grain represented. The council gave the throne to Horus. Set received his compensation. The world settled into its new, restored shape. But the war left marks. The world after the war is not the world before it. Egypt bears the memory of Set's reign in its geography, the places where the flood was wrong, where the fields were thin, where the sand pushed closer than it should. The divine family bears the memory in its relationships. Isis and Set are still siblings, whatever Set did. Nephthys is still married to the red god. Whatever her sympathies, Horus will always carry the healed eye, the eye that is whole but remembers being broken. The aftermath of the war was not quiet. Victory is never quiet when the loser remains in the world, necessary and resentful and assigned to a post that honors his power while limiting his ambitions. Set on the solar boat, fighting Apophis in the dark of each night, is a figure I find myself returning to with something that might be sympathy, though I am not sure sympathy is quite right. He is indispensable. He is also in permanent demotion. He fights the chaos serpent that would eat the sun, and in doing so he keeps the world alive, the same world that chose his brother's son over him. He does this every night. He has done it every night since the judgment. Is this justice? The Egyptians seem to have believed it was something better than justice. It was fit. It was set in the right place, doing the work his nature equipped him for, unable to harm the thing he resented, because the thing he resented was now properly defended. The myth resolved the problem of Set, not by destroying him, but by finding the exact location where his nature ceased to be a threat and became a necessity. Osiris, below, became something that the word ruler does not quite capture. He was the ground of the underworld, the substrate on which the dead stood. Every burial was a miniature reenactment of his embalming. Every mummy was dressed in his wrappings. Every dead person, when they spoke their declaration before the scales, spoke in his name. I am Osiris so-and-so, claiming his death and his resurrection as the template for their own hoped-for continuity. He had conquered death, not by defeating it, but by becoming its principle, by occupying it so thoroughly that death could not be itself without including his story. The curse of the aftermath was not laid on any specific person, but on impermanence itself. Every golden age ends. Every order accumulated entropy. Every Osiris who cultivated the world would eventually face a Set who disrupted it, and the disruption would last a generation, and then order would be restored, and then it would happen again. The myth encodes this explicitly. The Egyptians believed in cosmic repetition, in the eternal return of the same patterns at larger and smaller scales. The sun died every night and was reborn every morning. Osiris died and was reassembled every year in the flooding and receding of the Nile. The pharaoh died and was replaced by the next Horus. The pattern was the point. The lamentation of Isis and Nephthys, preserved in texts that the priests chanted over mummies, names this with the specificity of people who have experienced exactly this loss and need to say what it feels like. The sisters cry out over the body. They call his names. They remind him who he was. The myth understands that the work of mourning is not the passive experience of grief, but the active labor of refusal, the refusal to let the dead dissolve into the anonymity of death, the insistence on maintaining the specific identity of the specific person who is gone. Isis did not mourn a god. She mourned Osiris. The particularity was the point. Anyway, there is a question that the myth keeps circling without quite answering, which is the question of what death is for. The Egyptians had strong opinions about death, which they might have titled, "Death is not the end, but it is the transformation into something that cannot be reversed, and the irreversibility is what makes it meaningful." Osiris could not return to the living world permanently. Horus could not bring his father back in the full sense, could not restore the first king to his throne, could not unkill what Set had killed. The restoration was real, but it was a restoration into a different kind of existence, not into the old existence. The weighing of the heart is the myth's clearest statement about what death measures. Death is the moment when the scales appear. Everything you did while you were alive goes on one side. Maat's feather, the weight of cosmic rightness, of the minimum standard of righteous living, goes on the other. The heart is the accumulation. The feather is the standard. The result is the verdict. This is a theology that takes ordinary life with absolute seriousness. It says that what you do in the field and the market and the household, how you treat your servants, whether you give bread to the hungry, whether you testified falsely before the local court, whether you cheated your neighbor of their land, all of this accumulates. All of this goes on the scales. The divine drama of Osiris's death and resurrection is the frame, but what fills the frame is the ethical weight of ordinary action. The gods set the template, the humans fill it. The field of reeds, the Egyptian afterlife, was imagined as Egypt, but better. The same river, the same fields, the same agricultural work. But the flood always came at the right time. The crops always grew. The labor was not punishing, but satisfying. The dead who passed the scales went to a place that was essentially continuous with the world they had known, stripped of its anxiety. The Egyptian vision of paradise is not transcendence but perfection. Not somewhere else, but here, but right. This has always struck me as either deeply sophisticated or slightly melancholy, and I have never been able to decide which, perhaps both. Cedar, fate, the Egyptians called it Shay, a word that also encompassed allotment and what has been given, was not a simple concept in the Egyptian system. It was not the Greek Moira, the rigid portion assigned before birth that no one could alter. It was something more like the shape of your nature, the tendency of your accumulated self, the direction your life moved if you did not actively choose to move it differently. You could struggle against Shay. The struggle itself was part of what Shay meant. The person who fought their fate was living their fate as a fighter, and the outcome of that fight was also fate. Osiris's fate was written in the arrangement of the intercalary days, in the gap in the calendar, in the stolen moonlight that made his birth possible. A god born in borrowed time would die before his time. A god born in the gap between 1 year's ending and the next year's beginning would spend his existence negotiating the gaps between living and dead, between king and judge, between the world above and the world below. He could not have been anything other than what he was, but what he was turned out to be more than anyone had anticipated. Death, for the Egyptians, was the territory of Osiris, meaning death was governed, death was principled, death had law. This was not a small theological claim. Many of humanity's spiritual traditions have treated death as the place where all governance ceases, where the individual soul passes beyond the reach of any order. The Egyptians said the opposite. Order extends into death, and the same principles that govern the living world govern the dead. You do not escape Maat by dying. You face it more directly. The the luminous spirit, the transfigured dead, was what a person became after surviving the judgment. Not a ghost, not a shade, but something that had been transformed by death into a more essential form. The could help the living. The could be appealed to. The Egyptians wrote letters to their dead, literally, on papyrus or on pottery, asking for help with problems in the living world, asking the to intercede on their behalf, to speak to Osiris, to use whatever influence the transfigured dead might carry in the kingdom below. This is a theology of ongoing relationship. The dead are not gone. They are in a different country, but the country has embassies, and the letters get through. Memory was the medium. Without memory, the dead dissolved. The Egyptians believed, with a seriousness that shaped their entire material culture, that a person continued to exist only as long as their name was spoken. The pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, all of these were technologies of memory, ways of ensuring that the name would persist, that the specific identity of the dead person would be maintained against the entropy of forgetting. This is why the pharaohs built so large. This is why the tombs were stocked with everything the dead might need. This is why the walls were covered with images and words and lists of offerings. The dead needed to be remembered in specific detail, needed to be maintained as the particular person they had been, needed the memory of the living as sustenance. And here the myth of Osiris does something extraordinary. It gives every dead person the use of a god's name. I am Osiris, the most ordinary peasant, the most obscure fisherman, could stand before the scales and claim the template of the god's death and resurrection. Osiris's story was not only his, it was the story that every story of death could be told through. He had democratized transcendence. This is, when you sit with it, genuinely radical. The gods did not usually extend this kind of access. The divine world was hierarchical, was managed, was governed by the same principles of rank and precedence that governed the human world. But in the moment of death, in the moment of the scales, everyone became Osiris. Everyone had the same claim to the template. The weighing was equal because the template was shared. The myth traveled. Egypt was not an island. It was the most ancient and powerful civilization in a world of civilizations. And what it knew and believed and told about itself traveled with its merchants, its diplomats, its refugees, its conquerors, and conquered. Osiris became Serapis in the Ptolemaic period, a deliberate synthesis, a god designed to be recognizable to both Egyptian and Greek populations, combining Osiris with Apis the bull and various Greek elements into a new deity that could serve the new hybrid world Alexander's conquests had created. Serapis had a magnificent library. Serapis had a mystery cult that spread through the Mediterranean. Serapis became one of the most widely worshipped gods in the Roman Empire before the Christian period, with temples in Rome, in Greece, in North Africa, in Britain. The god who died and rose, the god whose death was commemorated and whose resurrection was celebrated, the god who promised eternal life to his initiates. This god moved through the ancient world long before Christianity arrived, and the movement left traces. The scholarly debate about whether these traces influenced early Christianity is old and contentious, and I have no intention of resolving it tonight. What I will say is this: the question of a God who dies and rises is not a question that occurred to any single tradition in isolation. It is a question that human beings, independently and through contact, have asked in many different forms, in many different places, across many different millennia. The Egyptians asked it very early and answered it very thoroughly, and their answer, that death is governed, that the dead continue, that the relationship between the living and the dead is ongoing and reciprocal, that what you do in life is weighed against the standard of cosmic order, is an answer that has not lost its power. The Osiris mysteries were initiated mysteries. You entered them through stages, through ritual, through the guided experience of a descent and a return. You symbolically died and were symbolically reborn. You came out the other side, knowing something you had not known before, something about the nature of death that the uninitiated could only guess at. What exactly you knew is not recorded in any source I have read, because the mystery cults took their names seriously. But the structure of knowing through dying is consistent across the testimonies of initiates who speak in the vaguest terms about having been changed, about having lost the fear of death, about carrying something back from the ritual dark. Osiris did that too. He carried something back. He carried the knowledge that the kingdom of the dead was a kingdom, ordered, governed, just, and that the ordering principle was the same principle that governed the living world. He carried the knowledge that the person who had made of their life something that Maat could honor had nothing to fear from the scales. He could not give this knowledge to every person he judged, but the initiates could take it from his story and keep it like a lamp. I want to think for a moment about what remains, not metaphorically, literally, what remains of Osiris in the world as it currently exists, in the year we are currently living through, in the specific night you are sitting inside. There is the Nile. It still floods, or it did, until the Aswan Dam redirected the river's ancient behavior into the controlled regularity that modern agriculture requires. The black silt no longer comes. The calendar of planting and harvest that Osiris taught is no longer governed by the river's unpredictable annual generosity. This is a practical loss, and possibly a mythological one. The god whose body was the flood's gift has had his expression contained, made predictable, made safe. Safety was not the point. There are the monuments, the temples at Abydos, which was the great cult center of Osiris, where the mysteries were enacted annually, and where the pilgrimage of the dead was imagined to culminate. Abydos was the place where Osiris's head was said to be buried, or in some versions, his whole body, gathered and interred by Isis at the site that would become the most sacred necropolis in Egypt. Pharaohs built their memorial temples there. Ordinary Egyptians left stelae there, the ancient equivalent of leaving a note at a saint's shrine, asking for the god's continued attention. There are the texts. The pyramid texts are the oldest religious corpus in human history, older than the Vedas, older than anything we have from Mesopotamia, older than anything we can clearly read. They were carved on the walls of pyramid chambers in the Old Kingdom around 2400 BCE for the benefit of the dead pharaoh's soul. They are spells, hymns, instructions, navigational guides to the underworld. They mention Osiris, they mention Isis and Nephthys and Thoth and Anubis. They tell the dead pharaoh what to say, what names to claim, which gods to appeal to. They are, in the most literal sense, the myth made operational. Something that old, does not disappear. It goes underground. It becomes the substrate that later traditions build on, consciously or not. When a medieval Christian mystic speaks of descending into the dark night of the soul and emerging transformed, they are speaking a language whose grammar Osiris invented. When a psychoanalyst speaks of the dismembered self reassembled through the labor of analysis, they are drawing on an image whose origin is the marsh at the edge of Egypt where Isis gathered the pieces. The archetype does not care about attribution. It returns because it corresponds to something real, some genuine feature of human experience that requires a story, this particular shape, to make sense of it. You will lose something essential to you. You will be scattered. Someone or something will gather the pieces. The reconstituted thing will not be identical to what it was. It will carry the mark of the gathering. Here is a thing I should tell you, a thing I am not entirely sure how to place. There is a moment in some of the later Osiris texts, the Hellenistic period texts, the ones written when Egypt was Greek in its upper registers and Egyptian in its bones, where the myth almost surfaces into something that feels uncomfortably contemporary. There is a papyrus, the details of which I will not pretend to remember perfectly, in which the scribe who copied the lamentations of Isis added a small marginal note, not part of the canonical text, clearly personal, clearly his own, asking, in essence, but why did this have to happen? If the gods govern, if Maat is real, if Osiris was righteous and his death was unjust, then what does the existence of unjust death say about the nature of governance? He did not answer the question. He went back to copying. But the question sat there in the margin, ink a little different from the main text, a human voice interrupting the divine narrative to ask the thing the divine narrative did not quite answer. It surfaces for a moment, then it sinks back, like something alive in deep water. The myth ends and does not end. What the Egyptians called eternal return, what the Greeks called anakyklosis, what we call the wheel, the cycle of order, disruption, restoration, and the coming disruption. This is the structure that the Osiris myth provides in its most enduring form, not as a historical claim, not as an account of what literally happened at the beginning of things, but as a map of how things work. The dead king's son becomes king. The living king will die and become a dead king. His son will claim the throne and fight the forces of chaos to keep it. The river will flood and recede. The crops will grow and be harvested. The heart will be weighed, and the verdict will be what the heart has earned. The name will be spoken, and the dead will persist. Osiris sits in the duat still. In the mythology's own terms, he has been there since the beginning of death, and death has been happening for as long as there have been living things, and the living things have been here for a very long time. He sits on his throne, green-skinned or black-skinned depending on which aspect you are invoking, the green of growing things, the black of the river's gift, holding his crook and his flail, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, and he hears the hearts. He does not rush. He has all the time that borrowed days have given him. He heard the heart of the first person who died in Egypt, and he will hear the last. And in between, he has heard every heart that has passed through the double doors of the underworld, every accumulation of a human life, every weight of love and selfishness and courage and cowardice, and the complicated average of ordinary existence. He knows us. He has been listening to us for so long. What he offers, and this is what every initiatory religion that draws on his image finally offers, is the possibility that the listening continues, that you are not forgotten, that the specific weight of your specific life is not discarded into an undifferentiated afterlife, but held, weighed, known, accounted for, that the scales are real and the feather is real and the reckoning is real, that death, in other words, takes you seriously, the oldest consolation, the first promise, the myth that travels under every other myth, the water table beneath the desert surface, that you will be known in the moment of your ending, and that the knowing is just, and that the just God of the dead has been waiting for you since before you were born, since before your parents were born, since the borrowed days outside the calendar when the world first organized itself into the shapes that would allow things like you to exist and matter and end. Osiris went first. He went so that the path was known. He went and he stayed, and he built a kingdom in the staying. Every human death since has followed the path he made. The crocodile in the marsh has not changed. The feather has not changed. The scales are perfectly balanced, as they have always been, waiting for what you bring to them. You are still where you are. The same room, the same dark, the same specific quiet or noise. Whatever you have in your hands, whatever is cooling on the stove, whatever the quality of the night outside your window, that is the context in which you have heard this story. The story is the same as it always was. The context is yours alone. There is something I want to say about that, and I am not sure I can say it cleanly, so I will try, and you can take from it what fits. The myth of Osiris is the oldest surviving story about why death is not the end. Not the oldest story period. There are older things, fragments, hints, images in cave walls that predate any text, but the oldest story we have that makes an argument that death is ordered, that it is governed, that it has a principle, and that principle is the same principle that governs righteous life. The argument is 3,000 years old at minimum. It is the argument we have been making to each other in one form or another ever since. I do not know if the argument is true. I do not think you know either. Neither do the people who believe it with great conviction, though they might disagree with me about that. What I know is that the argument has served as a ground for living well, for treating other people with the seriousness that the scales demand, for building societies in which justice was understood to extend beyond the reach of human courts, for comforting the dying with something more than the silence of an indifferent universe. Whether or not Osiris sits in the Duat, the ethical structure his myth encodes is real and functional and has made human lives more livable for 3,000 years. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. The wheel turns, the flood comes, The body is gathered, the name is spoken. Good night, wherever you are. Thank you for listening.